Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerCoaching.com. Today we have a special treat brought to you by the World Series of Poker and GG Poker. They have allowed me to review a Cards Up final table from one of their bracelet events. And I'm especially excited to review this event because it features one of my favorite poker players in the world, Joao Vieira. I'm probably butchering his name, sorry about that. But I've played with Joao for, goodness, the last 10 years or so at the high stakes live poker circuit. He is one of the biggest winners in online poker tournaments, and I am always excited to see him get in there and battle. Also, there's a few other world-class players at this table. This tournament started with 933 unique players. Some of them rebought, so there were 1,342 players. Really, not all that many re-entries. And, well, that's a whole lot of players. And 188 people got in the money. Here we are down to the final 9. First place in this tournament is $297,000. But right now, the players are only guaranteed $22,800. So actually, not a whole lot. So the players really want to win. This is a 50 stack tournament. So players started with 50 times the normal stack, which is why we have many millions of chips in play. However, if you look at the blinds are 250,000, 500,000. So 5 million chips would be 10 big blinds. So you see we have a 30 big blind stack here, then a bunch of 15 and 10 big blind stacks around the table. So most likely those stacks are going to be consolidating relatively quickly, and then hopefully we'll get to play some slightly deep stack poker at least. So there we have ace-9 offsuit under the gun folding, which is great. I imagine the threes just have to go all in here with only 6.5 big blinds. King-10 offsuit should fold. This should be a pretty easy fold. A lot of people get in their heads that, well, King-10's probably okay against pocket threes, but that's really not what you want to be calling off with for a decent amount of money. Also, whenever there are a bunch of relatively shallow stacks, like in reality, anyone could go broke at any point in time besides the giant 30 big blind stack, right? You want to be pretty snug when it comes to calling off your entire stack. So I definitely think the King-10 offsuit has a pretty easy fold here. And then Ace-King, of course, is going to call. Ace-King's in great shape against any range. It's only flipping here, though. It's always a bummer when you're flipping with Ace-King. You'd much prefer to be a substantial favorite. So, well, the pocket threes win. So now, we have a 3 big blind stack, which may heavily impact some ICM decisions. In this scenario, like right here with ace-queen offsuit, I would definitely raise. Don't get me wrong, but you're not thrilled to raise here because if it gets around to Oliver in this scenario, he can just rip it all in. And you have to fold because you really do not want to risk going broke to before Jose here with only 3 big blinds in a stack, right? So in this scenario, if Michael does raise and Oliver rips it all in, Jose should fold. Michael has to fold, and that would be a pretty nasty spot to be in. I would still raise this, but at the same time, I would be relatively cautious. With pocket 10s here, I would just rip it all in. I mean, this is a situation where I do think you want to be jamming very wide in Oliver's shoes. And that's just going to result in you winning the pot the vast majority of the time. And especially when you have a good hand like pocket 10s, you definitely want to rip it in. He likes to just call, though, which if you think Michael's range is super strong, as in reality it should be, maybe you don't want to jam with the 10s because if you're against aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, 10s isn't in all that great a shape. But if he's opening ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-10, king-queen, king-jack, pocket 4s, right, you're going to be in great shape and you get to just really lean on your opponents in this scenario. Rich had the king-jack offsuit here, definitely has to fold. Easy fold in this scenario. And I think the ace-8 offsuit should fold as well. Even closing the action, even getting good odds, you're going to be very dominated. And this is especially true when there is a very shallow stack and you're against the bigger stacks that can bust you. You really don't want to be playing hands out of position that can flop marginal made hands that are going to have a tough time folding. Like right here, right? If he flops ace-8 on if he has ace-8 on ace-9-6, you're just kind of on the hook for stacking off for your 13 big blind stack. But you really don't want to be in that scenario, so you're better off just folding early and getting out of the way. So Michael elects to check the flop, which is interesting. If he bets, he's probably going to get called by mostly strong hands. I'm okay with the check. This is one of these scenarios where Michael really just wants to see a cheap showdown with his very likely best hand. He does bet the turn, though, with what is almost certainly the nuts, and Oliver gets out of the way. I definitely think Oliver should just jam pre-flop, though, and that would have resulted in Michael probably folding or calling it off on a flip. If he does call it off on a flip, it's ICM disaster for both players. But I think that's probably just going to be the right play in that scenario to just rip it in with the 10s. Michael gets to open again. Everyone else had nothing. Again, I've not viewed this final table. There may be a whole lot of nothing, or there may be a whole lot of action. I have no way of knowing. I like watching these in real time. So in this scenario with ace-2 offsuit, I would just fold. Again, Jose has a whopping 2 big blinds. In this scenario, Victor does not want to do anything to risk busting before Jose, and he does fold. And we see small blind just folds as well, because if small blind limps, big blind can then jam very, very wide. This, I can already tell you, is going to be a independent chip model lesson. All right, ace-9 offsuit. Interesting scenario. I'm actually going to pull up ICMizer and run this spot because I think it's actually closer than it may seem. All right, I've run this scenario in ICMizer. This is a program that lets you look at shove or fold scenarios to some extent. Obviously, you can have raises in front of you, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very, very good program for analyzing final table scenarios. You can check it out at jonathanlittlepoker.com/ICM. That's an affiliate link. If you buy something there, they'll give me a few bucks. But I use ICMizer a lot when analyzing shallow stacked final table scenarios. So anyway, in this scenario, even with this 2 big blind stack at the table, I've entered in all the stack sizes. I entered custom payout, so this is all pretty accurate. You see ace-9 offsuit can still go all in. In this scenario, you probably want to shove any spot that's about plus 0.04 or more, something like that. That's of the entire prize pool. Whenever you shove, you win that much of the prize pool compared to your other options. And in this scenario, you see ace-9 is a pretty clear shove, but if you go down here to like ace-2 offsuit, it's barely a shove. In this scenario, if you do go all in, now the player in the small blind should call off with only these hands. Again, he should probably shy away from the very break-even spots, so he should be calling off with something like 6s or better with his big stack. And you see that the big blind should actually be calling off even perhaps a little bit tighter, even though he is closing the action. That's because his stack is only 12 big blinds or so. So if Joao here loses, I'm sorry, it's 16 big blinds. If Joao loses, he'll end up being a shallow stack. So ace-9 offsuit should go all in, and it is an easy all in with ace-9 offsuit, but this is not a spot where you can shove incredibly wide, and that's because if you do shove and get called, it's just such a disaster because Jose here gets to move up the payouts. We'll probably use ICMizer later throughout this. We'll see. King-10 suited. Well, we just showed you on ICMizer. A lot of people just call it off here thinking they're flipping, but you see King-10 suited is actually a pretty negative EV call. And Joao does make the correct fold. There are some times where you should shy away from ICM. Like right here, if you think you can call and win this and then just be in really, really great shape to win the tournament, you actually could conceivably call. Like let's say, for example, both the big stacks were right here and here, right? And then Joao is sitting here with this medium stack. This is a spot where Zhao's actually not in all that great of a scenario if he has the 2 big stacks on his... Well, 2 big stacks on your right is fine, but if they're going to be raising and jamming and whatnot, you just don't get to play any pots. Whereas if you can double here and then cover them, like see how both these big stacks have 12, if you could double to 15 or 13 or something like that, and you had position on them, now all of a sudden that's going to be really advantageous for you because they have to be tight because you would be in position with all the chips. If you call and lose, you still have a few big blinds, which would also be fine, right? You can sneak into 8th place. So I'm not going to say King-10 suited is ever a call there, but it could conceivably be if the table was set up properly. It's not, though. Here we have Oliver on Zhao's left, so no matter what, Zhao's going to have to deal with a big stack on his left, so that's not a spot to call off slightly wide. All right, we see Jose just getting absolute diapers over here. He has to fold. I like raising very wide as the big stack. You'd have to be a little bit cautious with the other big stack on the button, but I would still open the 9-8 suited. And everybody else has nothing, so they have to get out of the way. Pocket 4s probably just needs to be in. You may think, shouldn't I just fold and pray somebody else busts before I bust? And usually the answer to that's just no. And the reason it's no is because everyone here seems to be like reasonable over these few hands we've watched. Now, we've only watched a few hands, but given they have seemed to be reasonable so far, you can't really assume they're just going to be going nuts, right? If it was raised 3-bet, 4-bet every hand, then, maybe I actually should conceivably fold this hand and just hope somebody busts before you. Because the difference between 9th and 8th is a pretty decent amount, $9,000. But I think you just have to be in with the 4s. He does go all in. Ace-6 suited should fold. If you call or jam here, then it's, you're going to run into better hands every once in a while from the players yet to act. Ace-8 should call it off, as he does. And we have another coin flip. Unlucky for Jose. I was at a final table the other day in a $1,000 tournament. I was number 1 of 9, and I ended up busting in 9th. It's just like, you just lose 3 or 4 hands in a row, and you're out. Sometimes that happens. All you can do is put yourself in a position to do well. I've been streaming my online play. If you're a poker coaching member, that is available there. So make sure you check that out. We've been putting in solid 14-hour sessions on Sundays. It's a lot of fun. All right, Queen Jack suited for Joao. What do we do here? So this is a situation where if you do min raise, you're going to face aggression from the big stack some portion of the time. One thing I've noticed, by the way, is I play the big stacks much more aggressively than a lot of people do. Maybe that's a leak. I'm not sure. But this is a scenario where I definitely think playing this hand is viable. I probably would just min raise it, but I'd also think all in is fine. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't even see Martin here raise. Never mind. Now that Martin raises, we have a totally different decision. You always need to make sure you're paying attention to who's in the pot. So in this scenario, once Martin raises, which is actually very loose with this ace-8 offsuit. Oh my gosh, what do we do? It's a bad spot. You have to think Martin has a strong hand. I would definitely not think he's going to be as wide as ace-8 offsuit. Joao does elect to fold, and I think folding here is probably viable. You could go all in. You could call. I think all plays have some merit. If you know Martin's opening the ace-8 offsuit, you definitely want to go all in. You're just going to punish him by being relentlessly aggressive. But of course, you don't know Martin is raising with the ace-8 offsuit. So I like the fold. If you were on the button, I think calling would be a little bit better. If you were in the small blind or big blind, I would prefer calling. Cutoff, you have to worry about all three players yet to act raising you, which is always a bummer. Jack 9 offsuit, I would just be all in. This is a spot where as a big stack, you just can jam very, very wide. And every time they have nothing, you just win the pot. Whenever they call you, you still win 40-ish% of the time. So I like aggressive big stack play. Like even this King 4 offsuit, I would just rip it in. And like King Jack of hearts is in a pretty bad spot. Well, ICMIze this one. I'll show it to you. All right, here we have it. You see in this scenario, the big stack and the cutoff can jam pretty wide. Not any two cards, but certainly pretty wide. And actually, if you take a look at this, even the 7-2 offsuit, while it is a solid loser, it's not like a horribly terrible loser, right? And in this scenario, I may actually jam wider than ICM because I think people probably call off just a little bit too tightly in general. Like right here, we see the button can only call off with this. Now, to be fair, maybe the button calls off slightly wider than this. Small blind, one of the shallower stacks in the tournament, actually, the shallow stack in the tournament, right? Probably should call it off here with the King Jack suited, interestingly enough, right? And that's because he is the shallow stack. If we alter these chip stacks, I'll show you that in just a second, then this will become a fold, probably. And then we see big blind should call it off pretty tightly as well. Like I said, some of these hands that are on the cusp could perhaps be folded, but all these are like plus 0.04 or more, so maybe you just call the vast majority of them. Let's say instead the small blind had 14 big blinds. Let's just run it again real quick. See how fast ICMIzer is. You see now King Jack suited is a very easy fold, right? Let's say instead this guy had 5,600 and this player had 400, I know 4,000. I know we're talking in millions here, but we're simplifying it for ourselves. You see now, if the stacks were just kind of flip-flopped a little bit, where small blind had the big blind stack, big blind had the small blind stack, now King Jack suited becomes a fold. So you see how just like tinkering with this just a little bit makes it closer to a fold, right? Let's assume there's a shallow stack here with two big blinds. You'll now see they have to call off really tightly, right? Small blind still calls off with some hands, interestingly enough. Why is that? Well, I guess that's because button now gets to push 90% of hands, right? If he's pushing 90% of hands, you have to compensate by calling off a little bit wider. That makes sense. What if there were two tiny stacks? Let's see. Going through this exercise will help you figure out like how these implications matter. So if there are two tiny stacks, King Jack suited is just always a fold pretty much, it seems. So anyway, this is a spot where it looks like King Jack suited has a reluctant call off, and that's because, you know, the cutoff should be jamming pretty wide. So when the cutoff's jamming pretty wide, you just have to call it off pretty wide as well. He does not, though. And I don't fault him for making that fold. That's a pretty rough spot, but it's important to realize that the situations have changed very substantially from just the previous hand where there was a two big blind stack to now Neil is actually the shallow stack, right? So when you are the shallow stack, you have to be a little bit more inclined to get in there. Queens has a nice min raise. And I think this ace-queen offsuit's probably going to have to find an all-in. You don't really have many great options. I mean, this is another scenario where it depends very much on how wide Joao is raising. Like, if he's raising ace-8 offsuit, then clearly ace-queen's an all-in. If he's only raising with the absolute nuts, then it's to fold. You have to presume Joao's going to be playing some good fundamentally sound strategy that's not only the nuts. So I like the jam with the ace-queen offsuit. River is an 8, and Joao gets the double. All right. Okay, so we're down to 7 now. Next person out gets $43,000. The payout jumps in this tournament are relatively normal. King 7 offsuit just elects to fold in this scenario on the button, and I think that's definitely a good play. Notice now there are, well, multiple shallower stacks, 3 of them, right? So these 3 shallow stacks are going to force Martin here with his medium stack to play pretty snugly. I understand these 3 shallow stacks are not super shallow, not egregiously shallow like 2 big blinds, but you still need to be kind of tight on the button, and definitely when there are 2 big stacks on your left. This is actually a really bad spot for Martin to be in, where he's just going to have to be pretty tight, and most of the time he's going to sneak into something like, I don't know, 3rd, 4th, 5th place if he's lucky. Small blind probably should elect to play a decent amount of hands there, even out of position against Joao. I think it's a scenario where both of you have to be kind of cautious, and for that reason, I think you can still play some pots from the small blind. Ace-5 offsuit, I would put in the min-raise and then fold to Joao. I think that's reasonable. Now, again, depends on how maniacal Zhao's going to be, right? If he's just going to rip it in every time, then he may just fold the ace-5. I think jamming it would be a little bit aggressive. Let's take a look at what ICMizer says about all in. All right, we enter the stacks. Let's run the scenario. And it shows you can actually jam this ace-5 offsuit for your 22 big blind stack. And that's because neither of the players yet to act want to call off too wide because there's multiple shallow stacks. As we see, the ace-5 offsuit here is plus 0.09. I think, like I said, a lot of people are a little bit tight when it comes to just following ICM plays. Now, to be fair, just because a play is profitable does not mean it is the most profitable play. What this basically says is that at least you should shove this hand. Now, this assumes the opponents yet to act play appropriately, which maybe they don't. This assumes Joao calls it off with only the best hands for the 22 big blind shove. You can actually go through here and edit this. Like what if we think Joao calls it off like really wide? Take a second, think about what you think that's going to do to the shoving range, right? Like let's say Joao calls off this. You can click calculate, click ICMize, and now instead of shoving 49% of hands, you're going to find that now the hero on the button can only shove 11% of hands, right? So we went from, 50% to 11% if one player calls off a little bit too wide. So definitely make sure you're accounting for your opponent's tendencies, and ICMizer lets you do this seamlessly. So I think Michael probably should shove this, just because when you shove, you got to presume Zhao's going to play pretty well, which means you've basically taken away all of his playability, right? Whereas if you limp or raise, now you put yourself in a pretty dicey scenario. When you are against very good players who have bigger stacks than you, you usually just want to take the easy profitable plays, because while this limp may be profitable, it's definitely going to lead to way dicier scenarios, and I don't really know if that's what you want to be doing. I'm not sure. It's tough to say. This is one of these spots where it's like really hard to analyze, because who knows how profitable limping is unless you just have a ton of data. And even then, a ton of data against this particular setup doesn't really occur all that often. So he limps. Joao limps as well. I think Rodrigo has an all-in. I mean, he has a solid blocker, worst case. I like this. ICMizer can show you what to do in these spots as well if you plug in your opponent's limping ranges and then calling off ranges, which is very difficult to know in a lot of spots, but you can go through that exercise as well if you feel like it. Again, you can get ICMizer at jonathanlittlepoker.com/ICM. Jack 8 offsuit against the big stack and the big blind. I like just a nitty fold, so that's good on the button, I think. All right, we have a few real hands here. Michael's probably going to put in the min raise. Actually, Martin puts in the raise. So Martin's playing pretty aggressively. And this would definitely be something you should take note of. If he's going to be raising ace 8 offsuit, jack 10 offsuit, etc., you can really get after it against him, because he's going to be drastically overfolding to all ins, especially with a shallow stack. Like right here with these pocket eights, I think it's a pretty easy all in if you know he's raising ace 8 offsuit and jack 10 offsuit, because he's not going to be able to defend against the shove. That said, you don't know he's raising these hands, so I don't think it's quite as easy of a play. You're definitely going to play the ace. The question is, do you jam or do you call? And I think I'd probably just shove. He goes for a small re-raise, interestingly enough. I don't know if I'd ever make a small re-raise here, but again, Joao, I have to presume, is a much better poker player than me. And interesting. I don't really see how you can fold if I guess the play is to re-raise small and then fold if Oliver jams. You got to think Oliver's not going to get too out of line, I guess. Once it goes raise 3-bet from a guy who should be tight. So this is a spot where Joao looks to be opening it up a bit, which I like, actually. If Oliver folds, Joao's just going to get to run over the opponents because all these other short stacks need to be somewhat tight because of the short stack in the big blind. And if the short stack in the big blind wants to play, fine, it's okay. Notice Joao just makes a min bet on the flop. I definitely like that play as well. This is a spot where a lot of people just make a blind continuation bet of a third pot or half pot, but you don't need to risk that much. This is a spot where you can bet 1. And if your opponent does nothing, they're just going to fold. On these uncoordinated boards, you do not need to bet much at all when you have the range and nut advantage. Because you have to think Neil's going to be jamming all of his good, like ace high and king high, right? So Joao's opening all those hands. Neil does not have them, so it's a good spot to be aggressive. Oliver rips it all in again, which I like a lot. He's going to be jamming very wide into these shallow stacks. 8-2 offsuit. I don't think you can rip it in with the 8-2 offsuit. Also notice you're against the big blind. So I like the fold there. This is going to be an easy all-in for Neil. And I think both of his opponents are going to have to fold, even for only 4 big blinds. It is worth noting that Michael really wants to get rid of the shallow stacks here because the shallow stacks are kind of hindering him from being able to open too wide. That said, there's a lot of shallow stacks you have to remove before you don't have to worry about them anymore. Because if you remove one of them, you just have to worry about the next one, right? All right, so this is going to be a raise for Oliver. And, gosh, this is one of these nasty scenarios where it's kind of tough to know what Oliver's strategy is. If we know Oliver's strategy, well, let me go here and try to plug this into ICMizer. Okay, so I've entered the basic information. We have a min raise from middle position with 29% of hands. Now, do you think that's realistic? Do you think he's min raising all these? Probably not. Just want to show you how to go through here and edit ICMizer a bit. I mean, who knows what's actually realistic? Got to think he's going to play all the pairs. Probably a lot of the suited kings. I mean, these hands certainly, right? Probably any Broadway hand. So something like this is probably realistic. Okay, now we need to go down here and figure out what he's going to call the all-in with. So what is he actually going to call the all-in with if he faces a jam from the 8 big blind stack, right? It's only 8 big blinds. 9 or 10 big blinds. What will he actually call off with? It's probably roughly this, right? Sure, seems reasonable. So now we click ICMize, and it's going to tell us which hands the player should jam in this scenario. And as you see, King Queen suited actually is a reasonably profitable shove in this spot. Okay? We can also go over here and look at, say it goes fold, fold. What should the jacks do? So we would instead go down to here, run it again, and you see jacks is just a very easy all-in in that scenario. Now, what if it goes... what am I doing? So we want to do raise, then we want to do all in. What is this guy going to go all in with? Well, I think we just determined it was something like this, right? Well, let's just run this again real quick to make sure we're looking at the right numbers. Just run it again if you're never sure. Okay, so he's supposed to go all in with this. And now it gets around to the button. The button is supposed to call it off with only these hands. Okay? So jacks is still going to be a call if it goes raise, jam in this scenario. And that's because there's no very obvious shallow stack. If we put a very obvious shallow stack here, let's see if that changes anything. You see now jacks becomes way, way, way closer. So this is a spot where also if this player jams a little bit tighter, you're going to perhaps find a fold as well. But King Queen suit is just a very, very solid shove here. And I like the shove as well. This is a spot where you got to think Oliver's opening it up pretty wide. And yeah, we'll go from there. And given Oliver's opening wide, you have to think Rich is going to have to jam wide and have some fold equity. He does jam. And now this is a really rough spot for the jacks, but we just showed ICMizer said you got to call it off. And now back to ace-queen. Yuck. It's probably a fold. As nasty as it is. You have to think Martin has a really good hand. I mean, we just showed he has to have basically like jacks or better and ace-king, right? So how does ace-queen do against jacks or better and ace-king? Pretty poorly. How does it do against Rich's jam? Well, it's okay against Rich's all-in range. But it's a nasty scenario, that's for sure. He does make the fold. I like the fold. Now we're off to the races. Oliver kicking himself, I'm sure. I like the fold, though. Even getting odds. That's a scenario where he's in reasonable shape to just kind of sit here and continue running over the table. You really don't want to risk losing a substantially bigger stack than your opponents in this spot. So I definitely like that fold. Thought we were going to review this whole final table in one sitting. We're currently 14 minutes through the hour and 17-minute long final table. Joao likes to limp small blind in this scenario. I think you should be limping. You can't expect Rodrigo to jam too wide, given there is one very shallow stack here. We will definitely be making this a multi-part video. Interesting spot for Michael where I like the min raise. It's pretty nasty if you get jammed on, though, again, because of these two shallow stacks. Might as well ICMize them while we're taking our time, right? Okay, I've set this up. Now we need to go back and edit the ranges a little bit. So what is hero open raising? This does not look like realistic at all. So here's probably open raising in this scenario. I mean, I'd probably raise, in reality, something like this. Pretty tight, right? I'd be pretty tight in this scenario. Maybe you raise all suited aces because they have blockers. Something like this. Okay, so we're going to lock that in. Now we'll click ICMize to see what the big blind should shove with if it gets around to him, assuming hero calls off with this tight range. If he's going to call off with this tight range, player in the big blind should actually jam very wide. I mean, holy moly. That's kind of ridiculously wide. What if hero in the big blind calls off a little bit looser, though? Like this. Now you're going to see the player on the big blind, the big stack, cannot jam nearly as wide, only 5% of hands, right? And I think this is more realistic. So this is a spot where I suppose if you know the guy's going to raise and then call it off somewhat wide, even then, like, it's not like this is overly wide or anything. I mean, he's going to call off with these hands. It's not showing it to me. Seems like we found some running to a part of the decision tree that I do not know how to make the program navigate. Certainly not an ICMizer Pro. I just reference it a lot. This is a spot where I think raising the sevens is fine, and I don't think the big blind can jam all that often, especially you think Michael's a little bit on the tighter side. Like right here with ace-5 suited, if he's opening wide, you just have an easy all-in. Easy all-in. But if he's not opening wide, then you have to be way more inclined to call. And this is where it is very important for you to pay attention to your opponents and figure out exactly what they are doing, because if they're raising wide like Martin's raising, you should be ripping it in with this ace-5 suited every time. And if they're not, well, you should be very tight. I think this is just a check fold from Oliver, out of position. Even, like, whenever you have no backdoor flush draw, you just got to get out of the way, even against a small bet. The problem is if you hit the overcard, the ace, every once in a while it's just not even going to be good for you. Whenever you are against a hand like ace-jack or ace-king, right? And if you backdoor straight, yeah, that's nice, but very rarely you're going to backdoor straight. He does like to lead on this 8 turn, which is, I think, probably a good play. Whenever you have a no showdown value draw, which you have to presume you have at this point, you want to lead on cards that are good for your range, and obviously the 8's way better for the big blind calling range that should be kind of wide than the cutoff raising range that should be pretty tight. He just happens to be running into it at this point. But I like the lead. I think that's actually very viable. Because if he checks and faces a bet, I mean, check call, check jam, I guess. But you certainly don't love either of those. So I like that. On the river, do we bluff it? I think you probably have to. Obviously, you're going to run into the 9 sometimes, but not all that often. You have no showdown value here with the bottom pair. Let's see what he does. It's a pretty sweet spot to go for a bet. He's going to give it some thought. Looks like they have a forever long time bank. If he does jam in this scenario, it's a pretty miserable spot for the 7s. This is one of these spots where as the where the big stack really does get to apply a lot of pressure if they feel inclined, and you do need to want to make sure that your hero calling off appropriately, because if you're only calling with 9 or better, you're just going to fold way too often because you don't even have very many 9s in your range opening in this spot, you wouldn't think. So yeah, it's so nasty to have to call it off in this scenario, but I think it's probably the right play with a set. If you had like ace jack though, it's probably not, because your opponent, for all you know, maybe value jamming 8-7 or something like that. Anyway, once he does check, easy check back. And Michael's going to win a very nice pot. So we're going to pause the video here. We'll continue going through this for all of you. Hope you're enjoying this. If you are, click like, click subscribe, click share. Like I said, I figured we'd get through this hour and 15-minute long final table in about 45 minutes. We breezed right through it, but we're going a little bit in depth for you today. Why not? So that's going to be it for today. Make sure you come back for the next part. Thanks again to WSOP and GG for letting me use this footage, and I'm excited to see online poker is currently thriving. Lots of games are running. Everyone's in the action, and that's great. Anyway, thanks for being here. I'll talk to you again next time.